Today on my program, I'm pleased to welcome back Russ Kendzior, the chairman and founder of the National Floor Safety Institute, or NFSI. Russ, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Today, we're going to talk about an interesting topic, floor testing, testing for safety. And I'm going to ask some dumb questions and get some good responses from you because I don't know anything about testing floors. I know they can be slippery. Slips, trips, and falls can happen. But testing floors to see what the issue is with them, that's your expertise. What does that mean to test floors?
Well, it's funny when you ask people about how slippery are their floors, they tend to want to just like rub their foot on it, their shoe. And unbeknownst to them, everybody wears different types of shoes. So if you want to rub your shoe across the floor and say, yeah, it feels good to me, well, might not feel good to somebody else, especially if that other person's wearing slippery shoes like flip-flops. So how do you subjectively or, in a fair and unbiased way, calculate or measure just how slippery your floors are for anybody wearing any type of shoe? And so the best way to do that is with a tribometer. In fact, tribometers, which is a fancy word, by the way, Jeff, for a floor tester, been around for hundreds of years. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci invented the first one back in the 1500s. So it's not a new idea, but the process of measuring slip resistance of floors, or what's known as coefficient of friction, has oftentimes been very intimidating. It's always been perceived that unless you're an engineer or have a technical background, you really don't want to do this. It's too complex, it's too hard, it's expensive, and you might just do it wrong and come up with misleading data. Now, those days are gone. Today, there's a whole category of new tribometers, floor testers, that are pretty much fully automated. They're small devices. You place them on the floor. You press a button. They walk across the floor like a little robot, and they take very, very precise readings of the coefficient of friction of the floor, and then they give you a very simple printout of the data. So you can now measure very accurately and very easily, and by the way, very inexpensively, just how slippery your floors are. Of course, the primary key there is not only just the way you're testing, but to what testing method. And so NFSI has two methods or standards. One is the NFSI B101.1 standard for static coefficient of friction. And then there's a second standard called B101.3 for dynamic coefficient of friction. And without confusing your audience, it doesn't really matter which one they do or use. Many of these tribometers will measure to both. In fact, measure to both. What the heck? But there's two forms of friction measurement, static and dynamic. Without sparing your audience the boredom of what that actually means, it's just two different ways of measuring the same basic concept, which is surface friction. These test methods, by the way, Jeff, are performed under wet conditions. You put a little bit of water on the floor with SLS. That's a surfactant that it's an additive to the water to keep the wetting agent. So you have a homogeneous film. You don't have wet, dry, where the water would beat up. And so that's the method. The reason why it's a wet method is because most slips and falls occur on wet floors. Very rarely do people slip and fall on a dry floor, unless there's some substance on it, like sand or dirt or soil or whatever it might be. But generally speaking, a clean, dry floors is not really that hazardous, but they become treacherous when wet. So test them under those conditions.
So to test, tribometer, that's it?
I got you go. Yeah, tribometer.
Tribometer. I have learned a new word today. Thank you, Russ, for that. So NFSI does the testing with skilled or trained personnel.
Actually, we're going to train you and your people to be capable of doing that same thing.
Okay.
And by the way, you don't even need a lot of skill, believe it or not, today.
Then I'm perfect for the job. I'm ready.
You're the guy, man. NFSI does have a walkway auditor certification course where people that really want to do a deep dive into this subject take the course. The designation is known as a WACH, W-A-C-H. And it's a 4-day course with a written exam. It's a big deal. You learn a lot about the subject. Some of it is testing. But if you just want to take a measurement of your floor, say you're a manufacturer, and you want to test, hey, are my products leaving a slippery film, or are my floor finishes as they're applied, do they comply with the national standard for safety? And so this is something they can do themselves in the lab. And then also, Jeff, go out into the field. It's one thing to say, well, we tested our floor finish in the laboratory. Well, that's okay. That's a temperature, humidity controlled room with guys with lab coats who are doing everything precisely and perfectly. Well, tell me how that product works in my facility, in my hallway of my hospital or school or grocery store. And so these portable tribometers make it really, really easy to do both laboratory testing and field testing, where you can actually go into a client or customer's facility and see how well your product is performing. Now, Jeff, a lot of times manufacturers will say, we don't want to do that because if our product doesn't fare well, it makes us look bad. Well, that's the reality. Your product isn't faring well. It doesn't mean that your product has failed. It may mean that there's a film on the floor. Your customer is doing something to jeopardize or reduce the slip resistance. And both of you should want to correct that. And so getting data is good. Even if it's not good data, at least it's data that would help lend towards a prevention strategy for both the manufacturers and their customers.
So as a cleaning contractor or someone doing the floor cleaning in a building, when the testing is done, it could be my fault. It could be manufacturers. Different situations could be part of the issue. Have you ever had someone say, let's not talk about those results?
All the time. That's the most common response. If you go to any major end user or even manufacturers, large manufacturers of finishes and coatings, they don't want to talk about the subject only because of liability. And Jeff, I get it. Okay. Nobody wants to be, on the food chain for a lawsuit, but ultimately isn't our first and primary job to prevent people from getting hurt? See, the person that doesn't get hurt doesn't file a lawsuit. So let's prevent injuries. And by the way, that goes both ways. That goes for manufacturers, building service contractors, and their customers, ultimately the property owner. Everybody has a vested interest in wanting to know what is the risk of a slip on their floors, and not really for blaming, but for correcting. You want to know so you can fix the problem before there's an incident. You see, the blame game starts, Jeff, when people get hurt and lawsuits are filed. That's when the blame game starts. And it's, again, liability. So the incident, the accident that didn't happen, doesn't result in an injury, doesn't result in a claim, meaning insurance premiums don't go up, and it doesn't result in a lawsuit. But the only way to take that approach is by testing and by measuring. And today it's easier than it's ever been.
So what's it cost? Is there a linear foot cost or a project cost? Give us an idea of cost.
Yeah, it's up to the individual who's wanting the testing or doing the testing. You can either buy a device. They range. They're a bit pricey, somewhere in the $5,000 to $8,000 range if you want to purchase one. You can rent them. Many of the manufacturers have companies or organizations that they work with that'll rent you a device for a few days. Runs just a few $100s. You can also hire somebody who's a consultant, and they can come out and do the testing for you. But then again, that gets to be pricey. And so really my recommendation is take the time. If you're a building service contractor, you're dealing with millions of square feet potentially of space and multi-million-dollar, contracts. To spend $8,000 on a test is really a good investment. Jeff, that's one claim. Think about it. One person getting hurt can cost you far, far more in legal cost and insurance cost, just bad will. You might lose a client. So it's an investment. It's an investment in your business. And ultimately, keep in mind, Jeff, and I preach this gospel quite a bit, but the folks that are selling finishes and cleaners are ultimately not in just the cleaning business, but they're in the safety business when you think about it. Same thing is true for floor mats. Floor mats are safety devices, right? That's what they're for. You remove soil and moisture from people's shoes when they come in through the front entrance. So when you look at your product line in that, through that prism, that we are actually involved in the safety business, whether we know it or not, or like it or not, that really lends itself towards a view of incident or accident prevention. So, I like to preach that gospel of get involved, know what your products can do, and understand that, things happen. People spill stuff on floors and they compromise the slip resistance. Nobody's fault. It's just the world we live in. and identify those contaminants early on so somebody doesn't get hurt. Like I like to close a lot of my podcasts by saying, don't let your next step be your last step. And for many, it is their last step. Many slip and fall victims die. So let's keep it safe.
Well, this got serious at the end here. Let me ask another question. So I'm a contractor. I'm cleaning Walmart, and we do the test, and the test results come back favorably. I don't know if it's my fault, manufacturer's fault. How deep do you go from there?
Well, first of all, before you start testing floors at a Walmart, you may want to let Walmart know that you're planning on testing their floors, because they probably will not want you to do that. Any big box retailers intentionally, just again, this is a litigation strategy, do not want data from their floors. And I know this sounds counterintuitive, but they would rather not know, because they're involved in lots of lawsuits. No surprise, but big retailers face dozens and dozens of lawsuits almost constantly. And so the minute they start collecting data that's discoverable by plaintiff attorneys, and now all this data comes out and it can be used against them. Now, I'm not saying that's smart or good, but it's the reality. It's the truth. So number one, work with your client to see if they want that data collected, all right, to benefit them. But secondly, collect the data to benefit you. Because say, for example, somebody does slip at that Walmart, you don't want to be part of the food chain as a building service contractor or a manufacturer. You don't want Walmart to say, hey, look, it's not our fault. It's the guy that was putting this finish down, or whatever his procedures were, equipment. So testing of floors protects the building service contractor. It protects the manufacturer. It protects the end user. We've been talking about Walmart, but ultimately it protects people. And that's kind of where NFSI comes from, is about protecting people. But again, Jeff, it is a complex litigation liability issue. And the bigger the end user, the more this becomes an issue. So, if you're wanting to work with an end user and say, we're here to help you prevent injuries, prevent slips and falls, we're going to do periodic testing and describe to them what you plan to do, provide that data. Don't be surprised if they say, no, we would rather you not. But many of them, smaller property owners that are not facing the big liability, crisis would welcome that. And certainly the insurance industry would welcome that. Okay.
So to my question, how deep does the investigation go if a floor is not testing the way you want? Like, we don't know who's to blame. Is it the floor finish? Is it the cleaning solution? Is it how much you buff a floor? What do you do next?
All the above.
Okay.
If the manufacturer of, say, a floor finish going into a Walmart, I'll just use that as an analogy. If the manufacturer is not testing their product in the laboratory, at the factory, per the NFSI standards, then you have no benchmark when you go into the field to know whether or not the product is performing properly. Oftentimes, manufacturers will test to what's called the James machine, which is approaching 100-year-old device, very antiquated, somewhat reliable. It's a dry test method. And that test device has been around, like I said, since the 1930s, 40s, long time. And it doesn't really lend itself towards prevention strategies because it's not portable. So I don't really care, and I'm speaking openly, I don't really care if you tested your finish in the lab with a James machine. How is your product working in my facility, in my store? That's what I want to know. I'm your customer. And so test to the NFSI standards, because they can be used both in the laboratory as well as in the field. Now, how deep do you want to go? Well, the question really is, how much do you want to know about your problem? For example, it may not be the floor finish. It may be contaminants that are getting on the floor that are not being properly cleaned. Jeff, would it surprise you to know that most floor cleaners, commercial and residential, most floor cleaners make floors slippery? The more you clean your floor with a detergent-based cleaning chemical, the slipperier it gets. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because most cleaning products are been designed and marketed for two primary benefits. So let's just start with your home. When you go home and the floor is mopped, the way you know it's mopped is two ways. One, the floor looks clean, meaning it's shiny, right? Everybody likes shiny floors. But the second way, Jeff, is because it smells clean, right? You can have that fragrance, that aroma, that triggers the brain to say, oh, the floor is clean because I can smell it. Well, when you kind of boil that down, the way you get shiny gloss film on the floor and smell is by putting some type of a fragrance, perfume on the floor. Well, the more you do that over and over and over, the bigger the problem gets. I mean, you really find yourself fighting this endless battle. And so use products that don't leave a slippery soap film, because the products that are NFSI certified, for example, don't leave a soap film. And so you can isolate or identify the source of a slip and fall much quicker if you're using NFSI certified finishes and cleaning products. It's kind of a way to narrow down, if you will, what's going on, because there could be other variables, different things that come up in the real world that make the subject complex. So you want to test, use the right products, and understand that every element, every step of maintenance ultimately results in a potential contamination, a potential slip hazard that, sadly, you don't want to find out when somebody gets hurt. You would rather identify them before an injury. So, but as far as going deep, start with the manufacturers, go into the maintenance procedures, chemicals that are being used, et cetera. Make sure you're not leaving any films. Be able to validate in the field by way of testing that the products are actually performing as the manufacturers suggested they would, because they're testing them in their lab to the same standard. And if manufacturers, Jeff, and I'm going to be bold here, say, no, we're not going to do that, go somewhere else, because you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. And end users are today more so than ever, and it's been being driven by the insurance industry, are using NFSI certified products more than ever because they've been proven to reduce injury claims. They're reducing costs. But again, it's a free market. It's a very competitive market. And we encourage the end user to take control and let all the parties to the problem, the process, participate.
Mm-hmm. It's too bad there's no way to find out which NFSI products are approved.
Well, there actually is. If you go to the NFSI website, nfsi.org, you'll see a link that says certified products. You click on that and it'll give you a comprehensive list. I think there's 500 or 600 products, cleaning products, automated scrubbers, different equipment, finishes, floors, floor mats, hundreds of products. And your listeners can go on to the NFSI website free of charge and actually look at all the products that are NFSI certified, when they were certified, and they can make buying decisions based on that information if they really want to take corrective action.
I teed that up nicely for you, Russ.
You're the best, Joe.